And now we go back to postcolonialism. So postcolonialism happens in response to some of the colonial activities that we've studied earlier in the semester. And a lot of it comes about due to political changes where the colonial powers are forced to leave. For example, many areas of the globe were still under colonial rule at the start of World War II, but by the 1950s, very few were. So this idea of postcolonialism comes out in response to what happens after colonialism. One of the things that the postcolonialists do is they reject the idea of a binary perspective, black, white, heaven, hell, good, bad, male, female, feeling that this idea of binaries comes from the Western cultures that colonized them, and they may not have had those kind of concepts in their culture earlier. The post-colonial artists, writers, playwrights, musicians are trying to understand what happened to their culture, their unique culture before it was colonized, and what do they do now that they are no longer being colonized by a Western country. I think it's important to understand that this idea of post-colonialism isn't a romantic return to the culture as it existed before Western colonialism, but rather a conversation with the Western ideas that may have been imposed in various places and some of the Western ideas that actually led to the idea of colonization and the justification for it. The focus in most post-colonial dialogue is on the experiences of people living in the former colonies and the diaspora. And what we mean by diaspora is, for example, in the United States, we have a large African diaspora. They are people who can trace their ancestors back to the African continent and mostly were brought here as slaves, although in our era now, we also have people emigrating from Africa to the United States. So the diaspora are people that don't live in their ancestors' country of origin or place on the planet, but still are addressing issues related to their new life, their hereditary life, etc. A lot of post-colonial work is dealing with issues of power, continuing Western dominance, and this idea of neocolonialism, which is perhaps more economically based. So, for example, there are a lot of American companies who control a large swaths of land in Central America where tropical fruit, such as bananas, are grown, and while they may not be controlling the government, due to their economic power, they are controlling the situation as people in that area live it. They may have an undue influence in the political structures. And one can think of post-colonialism as oppositional to the dominant discourse. And of course, there is no one dominant discourse. Therefore, there's not one oppositional narrative. So, for example, if one of many dominant discourses in the United States is it's the land of opportunity and anybody can become rich here, an oppositional narrative would show how other factors are at play that might prevent people from all having the same opportunity, whether it's gender-based, education-based, mental health-based. There are a lot of reasons why that dominant belief in the United States is not really available to everybody. And then when we talked a little bit about the second wave feminist movement from module 14, we had this idea of agency or subjectivity versus objectivity. So now we're focusing on agency for marginalized people. And people can be marginalized for a wide range of reasons, physical or mental disabilities, the color of their skin, their religious tradition, their gender orientation, and the list goes on. The important thing to remember is that while post-colonial work is being done all around the globe, it is situated in a Western theoretical frame of mind. So some of these philosophers we've been discussing, these ideas we've been discussing from a Western perspective, are still being used in post-colonial arts. And by arts, I mean writing, music, painting, building, philosophy, etc. And then, as you may be aware, in our current era, we have a lot of issues related to commodification of cultures, where people try and buy and sell sacred objects from one culture to another culture, where we have some cultures, small indigenous cultures in parts of the world that are trying to survive by selling tourism to their culture. This, of course, is one of those subjects that we could probably teach a whole class on, but I just want to make you aware of it. And finally, I think what's really important in the idea of post-colonialism is the plural self. And what do I mean by the plural self? Well, taking my own life, for example, I was born here in the United States, so I'm an American. I've lived most of my life in California, so I'm a Californian. My father was a displaced person from Estonia during World War II, so I also have Estonian culture and ideas and an Estonian sense of self. And my mother grew up in Sweden, so now I have a Swedish sense of self, plus probably 20 more, right? And I think some of you spoke to this when you did your introductory videos, where you talked about different cultures that you participated in, because we all are living in multiple cultures simultaneously. This brings us to the big idea of epistemology. We've talked about that a little bit earlier in this class, but it becomes really important in this post-world. So epistemology is the theory of knowledge regarding its methods, validity, and scope, and the distinction between justified belief and opinion. Going back to the 1960s and 70s, the experiences people had there expanded their ways of knowing. Some of those ways of expansion were by physically changing their lifestyle. Maybe they'd grown up in a city and now they moved to a farm in the country and learned to become a farmer. Some of it was with the use of mind-altering substances. Other experiences of cooperative living, cooperative working on projects, and this idea of challenging the status quo. Also, as we're in this post-era, as I mentioned earlier, the relationships between data or information takes primacy. And what that means is if you have people's contact information, and you write a name on one 3x5 index card, a phone number on another 3x5 index card, and a street address on the third 3x5 index card. And you do this for 1,000 people. And you throw those cards up in the air. Is that information useful to you in any way? Probably not, because the connection between the person's name and the phone number is useful. If you think you're calling Bob and you're actually calling Sally, that isn't helpful to you. Then we have this idea of decentralizing knowledge and focusing on differences. What that means, again, is that there is no one universal truth. There is no definitive belief system for everybody or even for large groups of people, that we're all learning and growing in unique and distinct ways. As I mentioned earlier, just like in the 1960s and 70s, when the culture wars and the Cultural Revolution was taking place, not everybody was a part of it. There were a large number of people who resisted. Well, with what we're talking about now, it is very much the same. There are still a large number of people who resist this idea of the lack of a universal truth, that different people experience the world differently for whatever reason, and that is a contested belief. So what we're focusing on in this post-era is humans. We create ideas. We construct them, we build them, we justify them. We're focusing on these attempts to recover history, arts, and culture by the non-dominant peoples and cultures. We saw that earlier in this class where KPBS, our local public broadcasting station, did that wonderful documentary on the Kumeyaay people. That documentary would not have been made 50 years earlier. It is because now we're realizing, the dominant culture is realizing that there is value in these diverse experiences, these diverse ways of knowledge, and the diverse ways of looking at the world. And that's what this post-era is all about. I've talked a little bit about how we rework the older ideas presented in earlier time periods, and then reworking of historical contexts in history. And we've talked about a few ways this happens, but it also happens via technology. For example, a lot of archaeological digs that took place perhaps in the late 1800s and 1900s, assumptions are now being challenged based on DNA analysis of the artifacts, and that is changing how we thought the ancient Egyptians lived or the terracotta warriors in China were created, and innumerable other issues in past beliefs about the past. So the key idea here is the past is not static. The past is continually being reworked in the present. And then just a few paintings from our textbook to show you what this diversity looks like, how distinct different artists are creating ideas of the world. We have street graffiti is now art. That goes to that high versus low culture point we made in Module 14. Graffiti is considered low culture, but it also has a significant impact on how people believe, live, see the world, and interpret the world around them. Here we have Chinese Muslim incorporating Cubist ideas and human rights. This our texts talk quite a bit